I'm going to just walk you through the bill really quick, and then I'm going to tell you why you should vote for it. First of all, the bill redefines capital murder as being aggravated murder. It defines every aggravated murder as being a Class 1 felony, requires a judge to sentence every person convicted of aggravated murder to life in prison. The judge is then allowed to, if they want to, suspend some or none of that sentence, except in the case of capital murder, or aggravated murder of a law enforcement officer. The bill cleans up our code, eliminates any references to lethal injection, some of the secrecy laws we passed on that before. It also provides that anybody who is currently in prison who received the death penalty, their sentence is commuted to life in prison without parole, earned sentence credit, or geriatric parole. That's basically what the bill does. Mr. President, since our colony was founded, 1,389 people have been executed by our government in this state, more than any other governmental entity in the United States of America. The first execution in the New World that was done by Europeans, at least, was in 1608 at Jamestown. Captain George Kendall, he was shot for treason. Since capital punishment was reinstated, we've had about nearly 1,000 people executed in the country. Virginia has been number 2, only to Texas, since capital punishment was reinstated after Furman versus Georgia. Today, there's two, again, as I said, 2 men on death row, but Virginia has not seen a jury impose a capital punishment sentence or death penalty sentence since 2011. From my perspective, there's, I think, 6 sort of categories of problems with capital punishment as it's administered today. First of all, there's been 174 people that have been exonerated after they received a death sentence. A lot of this has to do with the advent of DNA technology. I'm sure other technology will come along, but I believe it's estimated that for about every 10 death sentences that are rendered, 1 innocent person is convicted. That ought to just give you chills to think of the thousands of people in America who've been executed, how many of them were actually innocent, given those odds today and how things used to operate back in the day. But I cannot think of anything that's more awful, unspeakable, and wrong for a government to do than to use its power to execute somebody who didn't commit the crime they're accused of. The problem with capital punishment is that once it's inflicted, you can't take it back. It can't be corrected. It's the only punishment that we render that we can't correct for in some way. It's not something the money can solve because the person's already dead. Mr. President, the next thing I would note is that I don't think it's possible to have a fair trial today in our current environment when capital punishment's in play. Nationally, according to Gallup, 60% of Americans believe that life in prison is a better sentence than capital punishment when it comes to murder. You all may have seen the Wasson poll last week that polled Virginians that said 55%, I think it was maybe 58% of Virginians are now opposed to capital punishment. And just so you understand how it works, if you're sitting in a jury pool and one of the questions you get asked in a jury pool if it's a capital punishment case is, are you opposed to capital punishment? If you raise your hand, you're thrown off the jury. And one of the things our colony, now our state, led the world in was the adoption of a Declaration of Rights. It was one of the first things we did. My sort of constituent, George Mason, wrote the Virginia Declaration of Rights. And one of those rights is that you have a right to a trial of jury by your peers. When 58% of your peers are disqualified from serving on your jury, it's kind of hard to get a trial of jury by your peers. And in fact, what that ends up forcing is a selection of jurors that are not representative of your community. I mean, back in the day when maybe 10 or 20% of the public was opposed to capital punishment, maybe a little bit different. But today, when over half of America, half of our state, most Americans are opposed to this, I don't know how you can get a fair jury trial on that issue anymore. It's basically become impossible because public opinion has changed. It's changed a lot in the last 10 years. The next thing I'd say, the third issue I'd think, is we ought to look at who we stand with today. Ask yourself, what other countries are still doing this? There's not a single other Western industrialized nation that's doing it. The country that leads the world, as far as we know, in executions is China. But we don't really know how many. We just know they do a lot, over 1,000. Next in line comes Iran. After that is Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Egypt, and then the USA. Right after us is Pakistan, and right on Pakistan's heels is Somalia. If we'd had this discussion, 7, 8 years ago, we'd be standing there strong with ISIS. These are the countries that are still engaging in this practice. From my perspective, these are not the kinds of countries that we aspire to, both as a state and as a country. This is not a practice that we, I think, expect the rest of the world to emulate. When we think of America as being the beacon of hope and freedom that it is, and we ask other countries in the world to look at how we adjudicate our people, and we look at how we treat other people in our society, this is not something to be proud of. And I think that Virginia can restore its leadership role in this state by being what will be, I think, the 23rd state in the country to eliminate this practice. Fourth issue, set of issues, has to do with equity. There is an indisputable connection between the death penalty and racial oppression. And that is impossible to deny. All you got to do is look at the statistics. You're much more likely to receive a death sentence if you kill somebody who's white and you're not. You're much more likely to get it if you're poor, if you're mentally disabled. You're much more likely to get it if you have a diminished IQ. You're much more likely to get it if you have a brain injury. This is, for the folks who end up commit murders often have different sorts of problems. Those problems put them in certain economic circumstances, and those things collectively often result in people getting a sentence that if they had the resources to defend themselves, they probably wouldn't get the death penalty. And that's also largely why now that the state has actually finally begun to invest resources in a capital defender service, you haven't seen a death penalty rendered in Virginia now in nearly a decade. Because once you give people good lawyers and you give jurors the information they need to make a decision, jurors suddenly realize that the death penalty, even people who are all pro-death penalty, look at these people and their circumstances and decide it's not really a fair outcome. Fifth set of issues I'd ask you to consider is how expensive this is. So the fiscal impact statement on this bill always drives me absolutely crazy. Every year I put this in, now I guess 2 years in a row I put this in, the fiscal impact statement comes back and says that by eliminating the death penalty, it will cost taxpayers $77,000. Because instead of killing somebody, we have to buy their food. And the $77,000 number, by the way, assumes, that's the average cost of a prisoner, but you don't have to shut down a prison to house these people, right? So the actual cost to not execute somebody is probably the cost of their food and maybe a little bit of electricity and some water or something. But in any event, I don't even buy the $77,000. But what that impact statement always leaves out is the $3.9 million a year we spend on the Capital Defender Service, which is spent to fight these kinds of cases. And the Capital Defender Service budget doesn't include the costs we spend for police officers who have to spend a lot of extra time in these cases, detectives, prosecutors. It doesn't cover the cost of expert witnesses that are retained for trial. You have substantial, massive expert witness costs in these cases when they go to trial. Time spent by jurors, by the clerk, by courts. None of that's included. And it's a lot of money. And I would just think that even if you assume the fiscal impact statement's correct, that we're going to spend $700,000 over 10 years to house these people instead of executing them. That's a lot cheaper than spending what is probably close to $40 million to have that option available over 10 years. And just think for a second what we could do with $40 million over 10 years and the difference that could make in Virginians' lives versus spending it to have this option available, which juries never use anymore. So just think about that as we allocate resources, part of what we have to do here. But it doesn't make sense from that point of view. And the last set of issues, Mr. President, what I would point out is that it has become virtually impossible to administer this sentence today, given what I think all of us aspire to in the traditions of our government in terms of openness. We adopted the Freedom of Information Act. I'm sure the senior senator from Fairfax can give me the date, but we try to do everything in our government as open as possible, subject to sunshine. Justice Louis Brandeis said that a stoplight, a street light, is the most effective policeman, and sunshine is the best disinfectant. And that's something I've always felt about when you're talking about the government spending taxpayer dollars and doing government business. Sunshine produces better results. In order for us to continue to do lethal injection, we've had to turn our sunshine laws on their head in order to continue this practice, because all the companies that manufacture the ingredients that allow us to snuff out a human life won't sell us the drugs anymore. And so we've had to resort to using compounding pharmacies that don't want their identity revealed because they're breaking their contracts with their European manufacturers. So now we have to hide everything from the public. And from my perspective, if there's any act that requires full and complete sunshine, disclosure, and information, it's putting out a human life. So this system we have has just become completely untenable. It just doesn't work anymore. And it's time to move on. Mr. President, we've been heading in this direction for a while now. The United States Supreme Court in 1987 said for the second or third time that a death sentence cannot be mandatory on a jury. We can't mandate it. The legislature can't make it a mandatory minimum sentence. In 2002, the U.S. Supreme Court said that we cannot impose a death sentence on anybody who's intellectually disabled. 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court said that it's no longer consistent with the Eighth Amendment cruel and unusual punishment prohibition to execute children. 2008, the U.S. Supreme Court said that we cannot use the death penalty as a punishment for crimes that do not involve a homicide. 2019, the U.S. Supreme Court said we cannot execute people suffering from dementia. It's just a matter of time, folks. And from my perspective, it's time that we move on. There's a dwindling number of states that do this, a dwindling number of countries that do it. Public opinion is now in support of abolishing capital punishment. Mr. President, I think it's time that we stand with the majority of Virginians now and all Americans and we move on from this. Please vote green on this.